Dear extinguished employees, board members, and executives of Rackham's, today we'll be going over our executive presentation. This is a high-level overview of our assessment and our previous assessment and how they compared. So, who are we? We're Finals 5. We have Gage, he is our team lead. We have Ryan, he is our AWS specialist. We have Derek, who is our AWS secondary. We have Daniel, who is our web application specialist. We have Meryl. We have Meryl, who is our Linux specialist. And we have myself, who is a Windows specialist. So what we'll be going over today, we'll be going over our scoring methodology. That's kind of how we score all the reports, how we use industrially standardized scoring methodology. Our findings is a high-level overview of what we found in the network, how things changed, our remediation things that we have going to suggest for you. We're going to talk about how you guys improved and where we can go for future steps. I'll now pass it off to Gage.
Thank you for that, Austin. So today, first I'd like to talk about how we're scoring these vulnerabilities. We're using the industry standard CVSS scores, which are a way to quantify the severity of the vulnerabilities. This uses just a 0 to 10 scale and takes into account the impact on the organization as well as the ease of exploitation, among other things. So let's talk about specifics with findings. This time around, we found 33 total findings, of which 1 was critical and 8 were high. Compared to last assessment, we had 28 findings, of which there was about a similar split with high and critical findings. And let's talk about how that compares to last time fully, in more depth. So we found 12 new findings this time around, of which we can't confirm whether or not they existed in the previous environment or if they were added to this one in the meantime, but we can say that they have been added to the report and are documented as such as new. So with the findings that are consistent across the environment, 7 of which are fully remediated and were not able to be exploited again. And of those that were not fully remediated, 6 were partially remediated, which means they were an improvement from last time, but there were still some more things to be desired with them being non-exploitable. And of those, the rest of them, 8 of which were not remediated at all, and similar to exactly what we saw last time. With that, I'd now like to pass off to Ryan here, who will talk about our remediation.
Thank you, Gage. From a compliance standpoint, there was a lot of improvement from the previous assessment. We found little to no personal identifiable information and little to no payment card information as well. However, in the AWS environment, we did find some potentially sensitive information in the form of boarding passes and barcodes. These contained customer names and flight numbers. We do have additional details in our report. Another major thing was with credentials. We viewed a lot of weak or default credentials in the environment, which is in violation of the payment card standards. And with that, I will pass it off to Meryl.
Thank you. So for our key findings, we had poor authentication and weak passwords. Firstly, we found default passwords. This was most prominent within Rackham's web applications, where the default credentials were left in place and access was gained through that. Secondly, we had easily guessable passwords. This was most pronounced in a Windows domain, where we noticed multiple critical accounts were left with very weak passwords and we were able to gain access that way. And finally, bypassable logins. In the Rackham's web applications, they use in-house authentication, where the authentication can be bypassed and we're able to gain access without knowing any sort of password. Secondly, we had Windows domain security. Our 2 main points here: the normal domain controller was vulnerable to multiple critical and high-level vulnerabilities that allow instant remote access at the highest level. These should be looked at and remediated immediately. Secondly, we had vulnerable permissions, where we noticed users in the domain had unnecessary permissions that left the domain a lot more open than it needed to be and allowed for too much movement and ease of exploitability. And now I'll hand it off to Daniel for remediation.
Thank you, Meryl. With remediations, we here at Finals 5 recommend a number of tactics that should be enforced to remediate any or potential exploitations. Firstly, password policies should be implemented and enforced on the network. These should be domain-wide and regularly checked to be in compliance. It should be changed every so often as the domain requires. Secondly, Rackens currently uses in-house authentication methods. We recommend that Rackens moves to a secure, online, provably secure authentication method rather than using in-house. And lastly, we recommend that every machine on the Windows domain network should be updated as soon as possible, and a patch schedule is put in place to ensure machines are up to date. Finally, I'd like to pass it up to Derek.
Thank you, Daniel. So let's get in and highlight exactly, like that in a good note, and highlight exactly what your organization did so well that we found during this assessment. So first and foremost, a resilient environment. During this whole engagement, every time we ran into issues and stuff, your employees and team were right on the issue and able to remediate any issues in the environment almost immediately, which was great to see. The remediation that we found from last time. So over the past 3 months, we were able to find 7 or 8 findings that were fully remediated from last time, which is always great to see. As well as the compliance, which is a huge win for your organization from the past 3 months, where we found both PI as well as credit cards in insecure storage last assessment, and we were no longer able to find any during this assessment. And then lastly, just general communication with your team and employees was always friendly, and everyone was super helpful during this assessment. So good job, guys. And then thank you for having us for your assessment, and we can take some questions while we have a minute or two.
Sure, thank you very much. We very much appreciate it. We've become really focused on the new TSA regulations that came out last March. What's your view of those, and where do you think we're most exposed?
Brian, you good on this?
I can mention on it.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a new paper put out by the TSA for more cybersecurity in airports, as you mentioned, and I think Rackham specifically, like we talked about in the presentation, dealing with passwords mainly and making sure that is secure and having those the environment secure with those passwords, and make sure there's some policy in place that maintains that.
Okay.
One quick question, because in the presentation you did not focus a lot on where do we have problems. Is it in the value system? Is it in the trade control? Where do you see the most of the problems?
Yeah, so specifically with passwords in the Windows domain, we found most weak passwords there and in all web applications. So that would contain the baggage check-in as well as like employee timesheets and all those web applications like that.
How did you all decide which recommendations to make to us?
Yeah, so we based it off of more or less industry standards. So NIST is a government organization that puts out some standards that are good to follow. They have everything from password policies to pretty much everything you want.
Was it tied back to the risk assessment?
Can you explain more on that?
Well, you presented a risk framework at the beginning of how you were scoring risks. Were these high-risk critical risks or vulnerabilities that you were recommending that we fix? Or these low risks, or these low cost? Or, how do you make that?
Yeah, so the key findings that we did put in the slides here, those are spread across multiple findings, so it's not just limited to one. So they're like, we had a different finding for each type of insecure authentication. But those were all in the highs, and the second key finding where we had the domain, that was the critical one, and that was some of the other highs that we found. Anyone?
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great time.
You can leave